Hello, everybody. I was told that you are the group that went through the drink budget faster than any other year. So that's a record for 4 years of this event. Congratulations. That doesn't necessarily bode well for me, however, because half of you are going to fall asleep, the other half of you are going to be rowdy. It's got the best of both worlds. Today we're going to talk all about what's happening in mobile and how do we account for it with the product experiences we create. This is a two-part sort of session. So in general, the way the format works is the first session is me telling you what I'm thinking about. And then the second session after the break is you telling me what you're thinking about and us having a conversation, digging up things that actually help you get things done. So first part me, second part you, and through that we create some balance. Without further ado, let's get going. So since you all were up late last night, I created some sound effects. Let's see if they actually serve my purpose of waking you up. All right, one more time because I worked on that all night. Thank you, thank you. And one more. Okay, come on, again. I'm just going to do only this. This is the whole talk. I have nothing else done. I just made this slide and I went to bed so I could go all day. Thank you, goodbye. So in 2012, there was a pretty big lawsuit. You probably heard about it. At the time, it was probably the biggest patent lawsuit, at least in technology, that had happened. This was Apple versus Samsung. And under contention during this process was about $2 billion. This is what Apple was arguing that Samsung owed them for infringing on a couple patents. And they had about 3 utility patents, 4 design patents for their flagship product, the iPhone. Now, lots of witnesses came to bear on this trial. There was a lot of testimony on both sides. And what it really came down to was one design patent in particular, which was quite succinctly worded. And it formed the basis for a lot of what was discussed and what people debated around this trial. And so this patent specifically covered the shape and form of Apple's smartphone design. As it was worded inside of the design patent, the ornamental design substantially as shown and described, which is lawyer talk for something that looks like this. And it was this design in particular of the smartphone, the ubiquitous thing that all of us sort of know and love now, that Samsung called a couple key witnesses in on. And the witnesses that they called in made a point, which again grabbed a lot of headlines, because what they said is this design cannot be protected. We don't owe Apple any money because you can't protect this design. And why did they say that? They said it's because it's so obvious. It's obvious that this is what a phone should look like. It should just be this, right? Apple doesn't have any rights to claim this. But when somebody says a design is obvious, right, what's actually underneath that? And how obvious was this design? How obvious was the fact that we'd all be carrying around a personal computer in our pockets? Well, to answer this question, let's go all the way back to the original introduction of the iPhone about 9 years ago now. Seems like it's a lot longer than that, but during this keynote back then, Steve Jobs came up and introduced this all-new product. And the way that he described what this thing was, because it was a relatively new thing at the time, was he said it's an iPhone and it's really 3 things. And they spent time talking about each one and describing these different 3 things that came together to create this new device. Those 3 things were an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. No kidding, these are literally the words they used to describe it, an internet communicator. And so let's look at how this fared, right? If there was $2 billion on the line, then clearly the thing that they put out there had to hold some value, right? That people were going at each other for this amount of money. So the iPod. The iPod portion of the iPhone referred specifically to this original music player pitch that Apple had. And the pitch for the iPod, I don't know if you remember this because it's ancient history now, right? Like almost 10 years ago. It's 1,000 songs in your pocket. Does anybody remember this? Right? You don't have to carry around CDs and tapes. You got thousands of songs in your pocket. And so thanks to Apple's iTunes music service, you can download and store songs. And this was very compelling at the time because compared to what we had previously, CDs and tapes, having 1,000 songs in your pocket was a pretty big deal. So at the time they introduced this, pretty compelling. But if you look at what happened after the fact, this is iTunes song download growth. You can see it grew a lot at the beginning. And over the past couple years, iTunes song downloads have had negative growth. Right, so was really carrying around those downloaded songs in your pocket or having those things on your device the most compelling thing? What about the phone? What about the phone part of the iPhone? Right? It's called an iPhone, so phone is obviously a really, really important thing. Right? Maybe that was the thing that really made this such a resounding success. Well, if you follow the years from 2011 to 2016, voice data has pretty much stayed flat. So not necessarily a ton of voice calls happening on the iPhone. And if you actually look at survey data now of people who have smartphones that actually take voice calls, back in 2012, pretty much everybody did, at least weekly, take a voice call. And now we're around 69% of people actually take a voice. Who likes to be called on their phone, by the way? Anybody? Okay, one or two of you. That's great. In sales, right? The rest of us, not so much. Just text me. Please do not call me. So, was it really the phone part of the iPhone that caused this thing to take off? What about the internet communicator? The funny thing about this, if you actually go and watch the original keynote, this thing got the least amount of time on stage. But if the iPod and the phone features turn out to be the secret sauce of smartphones, enough to merit this $2 billion lawsuit and above, what did? Well, when I showed you the voice chart, you notice my little key here, my voice and data. I didn't put the data part up. So here's voice, and now let's put up data. Clearly shows the big win here was the internet communicator piece. Right? And if you actually go back to the iPod, it's not that having music in your pocket was a big deal. It's just that all that shifted to the internet communicator side of the coin as opposed to the iPod side of the coin. You can say that's semantics, but I actually think it's indicative of the fact that what we've got these days with something like this is a personal computer in our pockets connected to the internet. Right? And this has allowed billions of ideas to bloom. There's 2 billion plus apps in each of the major app stores, Apple's and Google's. And streaming music is one of those flowers that has bloomed, both for Spotify, Apple, and a couple other companies. So Apple wasn't wrong about the songs in our pocket. They just are powered by the internet communicator piece, not the iPod piece. And in fact, that internet communicator piece is the thing that's kind of making everything go crazy. So if you look at PCs, these are global sales of PCs, and sorry for the ridiculous chart, but I just like to emphasize how big a difference the mobile thing is. And I kind of get to do that by having a ridiculously tall chart. It doesn't look as dramatic if you flatten the chart, so I like to make the big one. It's not just streaming services that are growing on mobile. Pretty much anywhere you look, right? Gaming, fitness, finance, people turn to their mobile screens. So as the growth of these devices in the market, remember this chart is sales, as these devices sell, more and more people use them. But the really interesting thing about mobile, or I guess the even compounding factor about mobile, is it isn't just that there's more devices, it's that these devices create more time spent on the internet. Right? It's one thing if just we took the time spent on the internet from desktop and all of a sudden instead of doing it on desktop, people did it on mobile, we just sort of switched devices. But that's not what's happening. Sessions continue to grow even last year, and last year mobile time spent grew 117%. Right? So not only are there much more mobile devices, but these things generate more time spent. And to understand these things a little bit more deeply, I think it's worth drilling into this line just for half a second. And the reason why I like to do this is because I think it helps us understand how to build for this environment if we understand it in a little bit more depth. What's behind these big hockey stick lines up and to the right? So to do that, I want to look a little bit at some of the demographics, some of the devices, some of the platforms underlying mobile. So forgive me, this is the chart-heavy part of the presentation. And so hopefully we'll get over this while you're still buzzed, and then we'll move on to the next thing. So with that 117% time spent increase last year, where is all that time being spent? Well, it turns out if you're young, which some of us may be, it is spent primarily on smartphones. The older you get, the more likely you are to spend some of that mobile time spent on tablets. Right? So you can see the 18 to 24-year-old demographic there is spending something like 87 or almost 90 hours a month on their smartphones. If you've ever observed a Snapchat user, though, that constitutes 1 day's worth of use. And it just goes up from there. And the other thing to note, though, is although there's this discrepancy of how much time spent is on which device, the full spectrum here is actually spending time on both kinds of devices. And this is one of the indicators, I think, that we are now in a much more mature market with mobile. Right? You don't see just sort of the early adopter phase. You see all demographics using these devices in meaningful ways. Now, because it's a mature market, we need to account for some of the differences we see of this wide variety of people. People are all not the same. And just to call out some of the variance we see, if we look at our friends, the millennials versus the baby boomers, you can see that folks on the younger side of the coin tend to really heavily skew towards using a phone with a single hand. Whereas on the older side of the coin, they're much more comfortable with two hands. Digital time spent, as I said before, on the millennial side of the coin, predominantly on smartphones. The majority of digital time spent for the 55-plus crowd is still on desktops. So while both are using multiple devices to get online, there is some discrepancy in how and where they spend their time and how they interact with these things. Now, as I said, it's worth noting, right, that this multi-device kind of world exists across the board. And just because 61% of time for the younger generation is on smartphones doesn't mean that they ignore the desktop. It's just sort of what is their primary device of choice. And we don't just see differences in time spent between demographics, we also see them between devices. So overall, as I mentioned before, time spent on mobiles up about 117%. But if you look at the range of devices that are out there, you see small phones, things that sort of cap out around 4 inches or so, only had an 8% increase in time spent. Full-size tablets, about a 26% increase in time spent. And our friend, the phablet, the 5 to almost 7-inch form factor, right, it has had a 334% growth in time spent. So those devices are really not only growing in market share, but really growing in terms of time spent, which is the same theme I said at the beginning, right? These devices are coming out there and they're growing how much time people spend online. Now, in phablets in China in particular, their market share back in August of 2015 was about 31%. In 2016, it's up to 41%. So a huge growth there. It's almost becoming the majority device of use. And you see this globally too. So if you look at sort of the global smartphone screen size trend, and now we're looking at a couple billion sessions of web use. Right, so these are the devices that are hitting the web and the screen sizes of those said devices. What you could tell is there's a pretty big increase in the 5 to 5.5 inch smartphone screen. note by the difference between the 2015 line and 2016 line. And there's a similar sort of decrease in the 4 to 4.5 inch smartphone screen rise. The rise of the phablet, if you will. And these trends are sort of continuing, and you can see them. I think the Q3 data for 2016 looks kind of similar. So this is a common story, as I said before. It's not just the penetration of mobile devices, but it's the growth of time spent. Because if you look at what are the implications of this, right? What's happening because the screens we carry around in our pockets are getting a bit bigger? And when I say screens, I mean personal computers connected to the internet, making the entire world instantly accessible to you anywhere and everywhere you happen to be, including the toilet. No? Nobody? Okay. So as screens get bigger, certain types of services benefit more than others. For example, this is phablet growth on news and magazine apps, and this is sport apps growth. And again, you can see that the growth on phablets really overpowers the growth on these other kinds of devices. Again, as the market matures, as the devices sort of change, the amount of engagement and time spent inside of these devices changes as well. And speaking of apps, right? What about apps? Let's turn for a moment away from time spent and usage for a second and talk about what's happening with native mobile applications and their platforms. Currently, there's over 2 billion apps on the Apple App Store. There's over 2 billion apps on the Google Play Store. That's a heck of a lot of apps, right? What happens where there's 4 billion of these things plus instantly available to all of us? Well, it turns out not a heck of a lot. The situation for native mobile applications, if you're someone who builds them, markets them, and tries to get people to use them, is very, very harsh. Now, why do I say that? Well, 25% of apps are abandoned after the first time you open them. That's pretty brutal, right? So you spend your money, you work super hard to get somebody to download the app, and 25% of them open it once and they're done. They're never in there again. Only 34% ever get opened more than 11 times. Also kind of harsh. Again, when you consider how hard it is to get somebody to download one of these things to their phone. The other set of things that make it difficult is while there's all this time spent in native apps, right? There's a huge amount of time spent, as we said before, and growing. 45% of it occurs in the single most used app. So most people have a single app, Facebook, that they spend the bulk of their time on. And then in the top 5 apps, it's even more dramatic. Almost 85% of time spent happens in the top 5 apps. So if you're one of those top 5 apps, or if you're that number 1 app, things are amazing for you. If you're not, it's a little more difficult. Some other sobering statistics. You're going to lose about 3/4 of your users in the first 3 days of install, and after 90 days, you'll lose about 95% of your users. Just looking at averages across all these different apps. So people drop off, they only use a couple apps. Even if they use it, they're not going to really hang around for long. Man, that is bleak. Why do we bother making these things? Why are there 4 billion of these things out there if the situation looks so dire? Well, despite the hardship of getting people to stick around, when they do stick around, the benefits are really, really clear. So if you compare engagement, in this case, average monthly minutes per visitor, you can see that native app users spend 20x more time than they do on the web. And I probably don't need to tell anybody that we're in this thing called the attention economy, right? Keeping people's attention, keeping them engaged, making them loyal customers is a really big deal. And so when you have somebody that is using one of these things, they can turn out to be very, very valuable for your business. And so the investment is worth it to try and capture that opportunity. Right? So attention in today's economy is worth gold, and these things are able to capture attention, provided you can get over a bunch of those hurdles I laid out at the beginning. So given that people spend 20x more time inside native apps, why even bother with the mobile web at all? Right? Why just focus on that one platform? Well, let's stretch. Huh? All right, one more time. Sorry. Let's stretch this out and see what's really going on here. So there's 188 minutes spent in native apps monthly and about 9 minutes spent on the mobile web per month on average. First things first, as we saw, 45% of that time spent is in the most used app. So that takes a huge chunk out of that 188 minutes right there. The other thing that we saw is 84% of time spent is in the top 5 apps. So the next 4 most used apps get about 73 minutes out of that 188 minutes. That leaves roughly 30 minutes for all your other apps. And then when you compare that to about 10 minutes on the mobile web, it's not looking as bad as it did before, right? It's actually looking kind of good, comparatively. So it's important to keep these things in context, because when we look at a lot of these statistics, they tend to be skewed by things like 45% of time spent is in one app. Right? And the mobile web also has other things going on for it. So looking at the top 1,000 mobile apps versus the top 1,000 mobile websites inside the US, which line is which, do you think? The light one is mobile web. The dark green one is native apps. So if you compare growth of audience size from 2014 to 2016, you can see mobile web audiences have actually grown substantially more than mobile native app audiences. And you can infer why this is, but it probably boils down to the fact that the web is linkable and native apps tend to be a lot more locked down, walled garden-ish. Right. So in the US, we see audiences growing more substantially on the top 1,000 mobile web experiences than on the top 1,000 native apps. And to put this a little bit more succinctly, right, when it comes to something like monthly unique visitors, time spent and activity within mobile websites is lower, but audience size and the ability to grow your user base and your reach is actually higher on the mobile web. In other words, it's easier to build audiences when things are interlinked and just a tap away, or a search query away, if you will. To put these two things together, we can sort of summarize this distinction pretty clearly. Mobile web is great for reach. Native apps are great for rich experiences. And I know that there is a lot of efforts right now to try and bridge this gap. If you were around yesterday, you heard about some of the work in progressive web apps. There was a conversation about instant apps for Android. Right? Those are efforts to try and bring the best of both worlds together. So if native apps are awesome at richness, but the mobile web is great at reach, why don't we bring some of those rich native capabilities to the web? And if native apps are great at richness, but it's hard to reach them, why not make them more accessible through things like linking, hence instant apps? Now, where this all will shake out, time will tell, right? But as things stand today, if you look at these two different platforms for mobile, there's clear advantages to each of them. You use the web to reach a large audience. That audience is maybe a mile wide, but an inch sort of deep. They don't have the engagement and the time spent that a native app does. And you use the native app to create these really rich experiences that keep people using your services and doing the things that help you make more money, if you will. And we saw this really clearly when we went and built a startup a couple years ago called Polar. So we created this real-time opinion engine, and the whole thing was around letting people essentially vote on questions, multiple choice, binary, those sorts of things. So our key measures were around how many people are expressing their opinion and how many opinions have we collected. And I've got 2 charts here. One is how many people voted and how many cumulative votes did we have. And I have not labeled the axes yet, but I will do so in a second. Because on the cumulative voter side, you can see when we started investing in the web, right over here, we were able to, in a short amount of time, reach a couple million users. Whereas our native app really grew a lot slower, and the audience size stayed a lot smaller. So It's easier to build large audiences on the web. We certainly found this to be true when we were working on this product. Now, the chart on the right is almost the opposite, which, as you can see, while we were able to grow a huge amount of web users, that small pool of native users still continued to be responsible for a huge amount of the activity and the usage of the service. So native app users spend more time. It's the same story I showed you earlier. And again, the easiest way to summarize this is reach and rich. And I almost messed that up, so I'll try again. Reach and rich. And when you think about a digital strategy, right, you probably want some combination of both. You want to get new people in the door, and at the same time, when they come in the door, you want to make sure that they stick around and do the things that help you and help them. So, a lot of things, a lot of charts. Let me just summarize all this in half a second. What are some of these trends on mobile today? So number one, we've got a pretty mature market, and that means we've got every kind of demographic from young to old and everything in between. And when you have that many people, when you have billions of people, you've got all kinds of variants, you've got all kinds of use cases, and there's lots of differences in usage and the like to think about, consider, and take into account, as we saw. Another thing that's happening is we're moving to this world of larger phones. And as we move to larger phones, mobile continues this trajectory of increasing time spent online. Not only when these devices came out did people spend more time on the internet, now that these devices are getting bigger, they're spending even more time on the internet. And specific kinds of services are gaining an even further boost from these larger screens. When we think about the platforms on mobile, web versus native, I think I summarized this pretty well a second ago, so I won't repeat it, but there's advantages to both. Right? I think the battles of web versus native, which have continued to rage for the past 9 years, at least where things stand today, who knows what the future brings, at least that there's some kind of coherency with which strategy makes sense for what. And an interesting question to ask is, given where we are today, how much of this was obvious, right? How much of this was obvious 9 years ago? So some of you may be thinking out there, well, yeah, of course, lots of people are going to use it, and totally old people are different than young people, man. It's obvious. Right? Big phone, totally obvious. People want a bigger phone. Anybody thinking that? But how much of this was obvious in the past? Well, the rise of phablets certainly wasn't clear. If anything, it was this constant source of mockery, as you can see here. I really like this quote at the end. The phablet is the ugly stepchild of the Bluetooth headset. I won't read the rest there, because it may be insulting to some of us in the audience. Right, but there was a clear disdain for these types of things. Apple will never make something as gaudy as a phablet. Okay? Of course, I won't get into how many reports of the web's death and the mobile web's death there have been over the years, right? Feels like these things kind of keep going in cycles. But the point is, we may feel that these trends are obvious now, but history shows us that many, if not most people, thought the opposite, right? Where we've ended up is not where people expected necessarily. And though things like, oh, bigger screen equals more use, duh, right? Though that feels obvious now, how obvious was it before? And to come back to this idea of obviousness, let's go back to the Apple versus Samsung trial for half a second. And here I want to talk about the other side of the argument. So I talked about Samsung's point, right? Samsung's point was the design of the iPhone is obvious, therefore it shouldn't be protected. Anyone could have gotten there eventually. Apple, on the other hand, argued something completely different. They basically said, look, we spent 5 years working on this thing. There was a huge amount of variances, a huge amount of refinement, just constant painstaking work over and over again before we even got close to what we thought was the right design. Right, just look at all these prototypes. Should we do that again? Sorry. I just live for these animations. Look at all these things that we did to try and figure out this thing that you're calling obvious. Right, we spent 5 years of our lives going through iteration after iteration to get this to a point of obviousness. And they testified that no design detail was immune from this crazy process. In fact, a single hardware button could be reviewed 50 different times, right? We'd have 50 different versions of a single hardware button before we finally settled on what that specific hardware button should be. Given 5 years, 50 hardware buttons, that's about 10 hardware buttons a year, if you want to do the math. Right? But all the details were painstakingly thought through, and there was a huge amount of iterative, ongoing work to get to this point of obviousness. And so the core thesis that they argued was, though this seems obvious, it wasn't. It took many years. And this isn't a unique argument. Right? Many of the things that now seem obvious to us, maybe larger phones, maybe the web being good for reach, maybe the inevitability of a screen being the dominant element of a portable computer, maybe they now seem obvious, but they took a lot of painstaking work to get right. And the way I really like to phrase this is design is obvious in retrospect. After the fact, after all the stuff behind the scenes is done, a good design should feel obvious, right? People like to use the word intuitive. I think intuitive is a little weird, right? Nothing is really intuitive except for the nipple. And even there's a whole profession out there that helps people deal with that. Can't remember what it's called. Lacometry, something? Lactation consultants. That's what they are, lactation consultants. So even the nipple is not as intuitive as we may think. Anywho, sorry, how did I get in the nipples? Let me back up. So design is obvious in retrospect. If that is true, how do you get to that point of having a design that feels obvious, that people can interact with it, know what it does, make use of the value that you're providing for them? To stick with Apple for a minute, they just released this new iOS 10 service. And inside of iOS 10, they featured a couple big redesigns of some of their marquee apps, including things like music and Maps. And Maps, in particular, was this application. Does anybody remember when Apple released Maps? Right, it did not go well, right? That was not a good thing. And people really maligned it. They said it was a terrible app, and it put them inside of rivers and all these kinds of things. But in iOS 10, the story for Maps has changed dramatically. I can't tell you whether or not it's still putting people into rivers, but there is a whole bunch of praise for this redesign. Here's what it looked like before. Here's what it looks like now. And when you go and see people talking about this, there's just this huge love for, wow, they made it so much better. Oh my God, it's so awesome now. Right? It's gotten so much better. They're kind of universally praised in iOS 10 for obviousness and simplicity of design. And we, as people who make mobile experiences, when you hear this sort of chatter, your ears perk up a little bit. You're like, oh, wow, whoa, what did they do? How did they get there? Why did they make something that's being universally praised as super easy and awesome? Well, we can look at the changes they made and take what is called this heuristic evaluation approach to design. Now, in order to do a heuristic evaluation, you sort of have to have some sense of what makes good design work and what are some of the kind of criteria that you use to look at interfaces to decide if they're functional, usable, or not. But you can look at a couple key changes they make and take this heuristic approach to identifying some of the reasons why it may feel more obvious, more useful, more usable. So in the previous version of Maps, in order to kick off a navigation, you had to tap the search field up there, which would often default to where you're at. So you'd have to tap search to get started. In the redesign, they've introduced this element down at the bottom, which says, where do you want to go? And it's got some destinations based off of places you go recently or things around you that are points of interest. So for this key use case of navigating somewhere, right, they've done some things to try and improve that getting started aspect of it. It used to be in the old version, once you have a from to kind of destination in mind, to get the route and to get started, you'd have to tap this little blue route button up there, which was just a little bolder than all the other blue actions. Right? And in the redesigned version, the process looks a little bit more like this. You have the place you're going, how far away it is, there's a picture of where you're going to go, there's a giant blue button that says directions, 30-minute drive. Right? So a clear primary action, if you compare the two screens, hard to miss that giant blue button, right? And is that blue button really clearly labeled? Yes, it kind of tells you what's happening, where you're going. And we use visual contrast to make this thing feel really strong and your destination feels strong. So again, more obvious of what you should do and what's going to happen when you do it. Another example here, before the place where you were going and how you were going to get there was sort of separated from how long it would take and the actions to go start. So related content, the destination and the route action, were separated. And in the new version, the related content and actions are no longer visually separated. It says to, from, my, 30 minutes, here's how you're going to go. And then you've got the options to change how you get there. And a giant honking big green go button, which again speaks to this kind of clear primary action, strong visual affordance heuristic. So net, there was a lot of design changes, right? Many of these things probably contributed to this overall sentiment, this is so much easier to use, such more obvious. But how do we know which of these changes actually mattered? If we're trying to imbue similar sorts of feelings inside of the services we make, how do we figure out which of these things actually matter? What many people will do, and I'll say this kindly, I hope, is copy. Oh, they did that. We should do that. Check it out. I've heard this during the conference, actually. Amazon did blah, blah, blah. Okay. Do you have any clue why Amazon did blah, 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 blah? That's the important part. Right? So we can look at, Apple did da, 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 da. Let's go do da, da, da. It's certainly one way of trying to do design. But I don't think it's necessarily the best way. And it certainly isn't the best way for you to have long-term success in this area. Because the most important thing is for us to learn how to do this ourselves and to gradually get better at it. As more things become software, as more parts of our lives become digital, understanding how to build digital experiences becomes a bigger part of our lives. Right? So growing skills in this area and understanding how all this stuff works is a really big deal. Now, we see these apps and companies making changes, right? And we react to these things. So here's a very common example. This is something that comes up a lot. So LinkedIn used to have this mobile app, and they had this little logo with an overflow menu serving as their primary navigation through the app. So the way you go to the different parts of the LinkedIn app, other than this home feed, is you tap that icon, then you get a menu, and you make your way through there. In a subsequent redesign, they moved away from this logo overflow menu and moved towards this bottom navigation menu. Was that a good thing? Yep. You work at LinkedIn? Seen the stats? I don't know. What evidence do we have that this was a good thing? We can clearly see they made this change, but was it right for them? Would it be right for us? How do we know? Sometimes we get a little bit of a signal. So occasionally we can infer that some changes we see are responsible for some kind of positive or negative effect. So for example, eBay did the opposite of what LinkedIn did. eBay went from a bottom navigation menu, where you can see sell, cart, home, my eBay, to a hamburger menu. It's actually a semi-hamburger menu. It looks like a fries menu because of that black corner there. But trust me, it's a hamburger menu. And when they did this, right, so this is the opposite of what LinkedIn did. LinkedIn moved from like a hamburger menu to a bottom navigation menu. eBay moved from a bottom navigation menu to a hamburger menu. Who do I copy? I don't know. I'm freaking out. People are doing different things. When they made this change, however, we can see that the ratings for the eBay app, which before were pretty positive, you can look at all those 5-star ratings. Pretty cool. When they made this change, look at all those 1-star ratings. Not so cool. So we can be like, whoa, 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 people think this sucks. Let's not do that. Again, we're kind of guessing based on some of the data we see out there. But do we really know which design changes were responsible? Do we have a better sense of what's to blame when, like, a month later, they add back the bottom navigation bar? Right? So then with the next redesign, they went from the hamburger menu back to a new bottom navigation menu really, really quickly. So is that sort of proof to us that, that's better? Because when they made that change, reviews went down to 1, now it's good again? Maybe. Sometimes we have richer signals. So Spotify They went from a hamburger menu down to a bottom navigation menu. And when they did this change, they actually released some stats and talked about the impact of this change, which is rare, right? Very few companies actually do this when they make these changes. They don't talk so much about it. It's all proprietary info. But sometimes they do, and Spotify came out and said, hey, there's a 30% increase in menu use and a 9% increase in overall actions. Is that a good thing? What is an action? I don't know. Maybe that's a good, maybe they care about that. I mean, there's more. Clearly, this is more stuff. Do you want an increase in actions in your app? You probably do, right? Sounds like, yeah, I think that sounds good. I should do this. So maybe that's a good thing. And we don't know. But, in some of these instances, we see people make a change. We guess it's a good thing. Other times we see ratings. Sometimes people release stats. And this is how we sort of see what other people are doing in design, right? And what is easy to do is to look at some of these things and send this article to your boss and be like, we should do a bottom nav menu, dude, 9% increase in menu actions. Right? Whoa, 9%? We totally got to do it. People are going to act more. We need more action. If we don't have action, what's going to happen? Right? Let's get that 9% action now. All right, let's do it. Designer, give me a mock-up. Developer, build it. Sweet dude, drinks. Such is the life. But in order to illuminate what goes behind these kinds of design decisions, I want to take you behind the curtain. I want to take you behind the scenes and walk through what's actually going on when people make these kinds of decisions. And to do so, I'm going to talk over something that at the time we did it was highly controversial and has since become much less controversial. But when we did this, there was a lot of, how shall I say, resistance. And now I think that there's less. So what is this change I'm talking about? It's very related to the things I showed you before. And we added a bottom navigation menu to an Android app from Google, which did not exist before. Now, let me tell you the story around why we decided to do this. Right? So again, you may say, oh, Google added a bottom nav menu. What does it mean? Well, we did this for a few reasons. First of all, why am I talking so much about navigation changes? I think it's worth pausing for a second and explaining myself here. Why is Luke talking about bottom navigation menus and hamburger menus and all this stuff? The navigational structure of an application or of a website tells people what it is for. It explains to them what services you offer, what value you provide, and hopefully makes it as clear as possible to them that that's what you're all about. So the design of a navigational system and the representation of that navigational system within your interface is actually a huge deal, right? It's not just like a detail of the design process. It's fundamental to user comprehension, to usage, engagement, and all those good things. It sets up a mental model for how do I use this thing and what is it for. So it's a really big deal. So because it's a really big deal, we take it really seriously, and we spend a lot of time thinking about what is the right way to do this. So why do we do this? Well, one of the big reasons for doing this was to create a focus on the primary purpose of this service. And there has been lots of things that have been built up over a 5-year history of the product. And what happened in the product before, this is what it used to look like, was all those things that had been built up over the 5-year history were aggregated under this toggle menu. So at the top of the screen, there's this thing called Home with a teeny little arrow, and it sat there. And if you were to tap that teeny little arrow section, you would get a laundry list of everything that was inside of this application. Right? So hit the home thing and get to see all the stuff. And when you opened it up, all these things, whether they were home or communities or photos or locations or events, were represented relatively equally inside of here. We just had a long list of all the stuff that was inside of this app. Now, it turns out that despite there being a lot of things inside of a service like this, not all things get used equally. So our first step was to try and figure out, well, what's really the most important here? What provides the most value for people? And we tried to get at that information a couple different ways. One, we established a little community of people, not little, large, community of people who use the service a ton. And we would occasionally send them surveys, we'd ask them questions, we'd talk to them, we'd have them try stuff. And one of the things that we asked them for early on was giving us a sense of how much do you use each of the things that are inside here. And what we found was two features in particular really stuck out. More than 80% of people use this thing, communities, multiple times a week. And more than 70% of people use this thing, collections, more than 2 to 3 times a week. So we had this sort of qualitative sense of, hey, this is the stuff that's most important to me. And then, of course, we went and looked at our data, and we tried to back that up. Well, people are telling us this, but is it really true? So let's see how much are people actually using from a quantitative perspective. And we saw something like communities was getting about 1.2 million joins a day. So clearly, that was a really big feature, given how many people were actually making use of it on a daily basis. And I want to pause here for a second and remind us why we need both quantitative and qualitative data. So let me ask you a question. What does this chart represent? Anybody have an idea? Go ahead. It's okay. Throw one out. Nothing? The what? User flow, okay. Certainly some flow happening here. The what? Okay, no. I don't know what that is. These are the computers on bike riders in the Tour de France. And in 2016, on the 3rd stage of the Tour de France, there was a huge accident. And that's what happened to all the data from all these different bike computers. They just blew up. Now, why do I show this? I show this because this paints a really different picture of what's happening than this. Right? The data, the quantitative side of the coin, gives you a certain view. Oh, shit just got messed up. The qualitative side of the coin paints a very different picture of what's going on. And you get a very different feeling for this incident when you see the guy bleeding, when you see the rider crying on the ground because the event that he trained the past 5 years for is over for him because of a crash. Right? And you just don't get that kind of insight by looking strictly at the numbers. And so anything and everything that we try to do, we always try to take a quantitative and a qualitative look at what's going on. The quant will tell you what, the qual will tell you why. So, coming back to this, the other information qualitative data gave us, observing people, talking to them, was that people that were new to this app, when they came in, they were just overwhelmed by this, right? They had a hard time making sense of all these features and all these concepts that had been built up over 5 years worth of product development. They looked at it like, oh, I don't even know what to do here. There's so many things. What do I do and why? And so we really wanted to address these two issues we saw. We wanted to simplify the product, especially for newcomers, and we wanted to make important features front and center for those who were regular users. And it's important to note that, a lot of times people feel like you can't do a single thing that serves both new users and existing users. But I don't believe that's necessarily true, and I think the right kind of design solution can actually have benefits for both sides of the coin. So given we wanted to simplify the product and we wanted to make important features front and center, we turned to the navigation system. We thought, what can we do to make some changes here that will address these two core issues? And we started a series of navigation explorations. Essentially, we built prototypes, and in these prototypes, we focused on organizing the app in different ways. So what was visible to users, and how could they use that to make their way through the service? And what these navigation explorations look like is we'd make some comps, we'd build a prototype, we'd put it in the lab, and we just sort of rinse and repeat week after week for about 7 weeks until we had something we felt good about. And the thing we felt good about was this bottom bar. When we ran people through a prototype using this bottom bar, we saw 2 important behaviors come out that helped us feel like we accomplished our goals. we saw that people that were new just right away came in there and started moving through the tabs, right? And they're like, oh, okay, I see all this stuff. They used it to explore right away. And then we saw that people that were regular users really liked the fact that the things they used the most were easily accessible to them, right? They brought the core features that they cared about right in focus. So this navigation experience was an instant hit. And this behavior of people exploring the app was totally absent in the previous version. Right? You never saw anybody go through the different sections and start to understand what was available to them, because that little home thing was really out of sight and therefore out of mind, and they never interacted with it. So that was kind of one big reason. We wanted to put this focus on core features, we wanted to simplify, and we wanted to make the thing that people use the most quickly accessible and obvious to them. But we also had another goal around growing critical engagement. And while we were doing some of this qualitative work in the lab, talking to people, running them through the prototypes, we were also doing some quantitative work. In particular, we ran this thing called a survival analysis. And a survival analysis is a really interesting way to sort of model what keeps people around in a service. And so what you do is you take a look at actions and you try and plot a curve that correlates actions that people take with how long they stick around inside of the application. And so we had a list of actions like following a collection, making a comment, following a user, what have you, and we ended up plotting which of these things was the strongest indicator of who comes back after their first day of use. We ran about 1 million or so sessions through here and kind of came back with this analysis. And so what you see here is it turns out that following this collection, which was a popular feature before, was the biggest indicator of who comes back after their first day. When we looked at the same survival analysis, but for 3 weeks out, who was still around in the application 3 weeks later, you can see things shifted around a little bit. And the strongest indicator of who was around 3 weeks later was people who were joining communities. So through this quantitative look at behavior, right, through understanding what keeps people around, we're able to map the early things that they do as part of a first run experience to much later retention. And we knew that these two things, collections and communities, were critical, because we saw the biggest indicator of who comes back the next day is following one of these things. The biggest indicator of who comes back 3 weeks later is joining one of these things. And guess what we put inside of that bottom navigation? Those two things. So what happened when we put those things down in the bottom navigation? Well, when we looked at daily active users on the collection screen, we saw a 600%, 6x increase in the amount of people viewing that. You can see here is our little test where we rolled it out earlier and then rolled out the full thing. This 6x increase in people hitting this resulted in a 3x increase in the amount of people who were following collections. Just huge, right? We're not talking about like 30% here. We're talking 600, 300% changes. Similar things happen to communities. You can see the daily active users on the community screen. You can see daily community joins. Right? So taking this critical action and making it visible front and center in navigation had stepladder changes in what we're doing. And again, if you come back to our survival analysis, it showed that the strongest indicators of returning on the second day and the third day were the two things that we just had stepladder functions in engagement on. You can quickly infer what kind of impact this navigation change had on our critical metrics. So, a couple big reasons why this change was made. Another one, though, which comes back to some of the stuff I talked about earlier, is around ergonomics. And I mentioned that our friend, the phablet, right, is the place where time spent is growing the most. And in fact, media services and magazine things, which is a lot of the kind of usage that we see inside of Google+, people keeping up with content or on specific topics, was really growing on these kinds of devices. And if you look at the market overall, right, and you sort of follow the trend line globally of how these larger phones are growing, the dark green section is phablets. Over here on the right is tablets, and on the left is the smaller and medium-sized phones. So we wanted to kind of build for the future, too. We wanted to build something that accounts for the changing environment of mobile so that the solutions we build are things that people can comfortably and effectively use on the most popular devices. And by the way, there's an interesting conversation to be had around what is the personal computer. This is sort of a side tangent, but if you look in Apple's lineup, it costs about $1,000 to get each one of these things. One screen is a little smaller. They both have about 256 gigabytes of storage. This one's actually got better battery life and a better camera, but they both have pretty fast processors. What is the PC today? Side tangent over. When you come back to looking at these large devices, though, and why am I talking about it from an ergonomic perspective, the ability for people to quickly and easily access things that are on top of the screen really decreases as screen size goes up. All right, you can see the ow zone at the top there growing as you get to a larger and larger form factor. All right, so as you become more phablety, top of the screen becomes more ouchity. You can quote me on that. And so what does that mean from a design perspective? Well, if you look at what's happening over here in an application like Swarm, which is designed for allowing people to check into locations and say where they're at, they used to have the check-in button, which is what the whole service is for, up in the upper right. And in a redesign, they put it down right in the center. And why did they do that? Because they put it in the comfy zone, the easy-to-hit zone. And remember, our friends, the millennials, are all about the one-handedness. And so there's design things that you can, design changes you can make to sort of account for these kinds of behaviors. Amazon Music is another good example. They used to have this hard-to-reach control in the upper left, and when you opened up that menu, that's where all your nav was, and it was organized top to bottom, so the most important stuff was at the top. They did one redesign where they sort of center positioned these options and now made them accessible a little bit more easily, although you still had to use that hamburger menu to access it. And then they did a redesign just about a couple of weeks ago where they put this bottom navigation menu in place. And the interesting thing about the bottom navigation menu in their case isn't just that your primary controls are in a comfy, easy-to-reach spot on a big phone as opposed to being up there. Well, you can kind of get to if you really... In addition to them being down there, they actually have this little affordance. You see that arrow going up? So what you can do with a really quick gesture is just sort of flick up, and up comes the play screen, right? So you just sort of flick your hand up, and up comes this interface. And then if you just sort of flick it down, it comes away, comes down. So it's an interesting way of sort of designing for this form factor because you can just go to get to the primary controls of playing your music, which is what the whole app is for. You see similar design principles happening inside of the Apple Maps app that I described earlier. When you've got this direction sheet, it's a little card on the bottom, and a quick flick up brings up all this additional information around it, and a quick flick down brings it back to where it was before. And you see this pattern showing up multiple times inside of that app. When you're on the directions thing and you are currently getting directions, there's a big end button, but you can also flick up and get an overview, get details, tweak the audio. And here, one of the other things that's worth noting is, do you see this like grayed out area here? It's super easy just to like sort of hit that anywhere. You just sort of slap it and the thing comes back. So this big kind of huge gesture target area are just like and it fades. And what's interesting about both of these interactions, both this kind of like flick up, flip down with your big fat thumb, tap anywhere to make things go away, is it accounts for the fact that when it comes to gestures, we're pretty sloppy. What does that mean? Well, it means a couple things. One, when you have this navigational list and you're able to scroll it with, say, one finger, right? You touch it and you scroll it with one finger. Imagine if putting two fingers down on this all of a sudden like deleted items or changed modes or something like this. Instead, what happens is when you use two fingers, it does the exact same thing. It still scrolls. And you can come back down with one finger. And so one of the principles to account for the fact that gestures are sloppy, our hands are imprecise, these things sort of wobble in our hands, is to allow multiple fingers to account for the same interaction. So instead of having this dramatic change, one finger, two finger, on a key interaction, just actually support multiple fingers and let it work regardless. So that's one of the ways of dealing with these larger form factors and the way our hands and ergonomics work. Another one, and this is an example from an app we used to have about a year ago, is accounting for thumb flow. So you can see here by just sort of scrolling up the list, you can tap things right in the center of the screen, this comfortable to hit zone. And as you scroll up, let's say you get to the end of a list here, you can see a little tip comes up. And right there, these two options, more info or no thanks, are right in the comfortable tip zone. So we can actually use that to teach people. In this case, we taught them they can swipe across things. And again, super comfortable right in that little thing. Now, to get to the menu, you can just pull it down. And hold on one second. Here we go. To drag to refresh, there's a polar bear in his underwear. Again, you just sort of pull down and land right back where you were. And so a lot of the behavior, there's that bear in his underwear again, a lot of this behavior has really been designed around this kind of use, right? Single thumb on the screen. If you look at all the stuff that you're able to do, there's 6 different things in here that account for this kind of behavior. So it's another way of thinking about designing the application for the realities of use. Another one, if we go to an app that has kind of a gallery mode, how do you get out of that? Well, we can give them a little tip to just sort of pinch anywhere. And they can take 2 or 3 fingers, remember support multiple fingers, and get out of that gallery view. So 3 fingers gets you back to the app. But we can also support like really big grabby gestures. So just like grab the screen with all your fingers and throw it away. And the bigger the screen, the bigger gesture it kind of invites. This is what I was getting at with that Apple Maps example, right? Use that whole grayed out area, tap anywhere, let people come out of there. And think in terms of this really precise software world we're used to with mice and keyboards. Instead, really this sort of less precise, grabby, kind of big finger approach. And it's a way that we can ultimately design for the changing form factors of devices. Now, not all is rosy when we do these kind of bottom cards, because there's another example here when you use the redesigned Apple Music app. Anyone know how you can shuffle or repeat your music here? Shake, okay, that's a good guess. Hit these little buttons? No, that's actually just changing where you play it. It doesn't have anything to do with it. Anyone? Tap the image? No, it doesn't do it either. The arrow at the tap the arrow at the top? No. That just moves it down and comes back to your library. Anyone? Scrolling the text to the left? Nope. Drag the whole screen upward? Yes. The way you do it is you pull up, like so. And there is shuffle and repeat. Why did nobody know that? Many of you in the audience are probably, oh, yeah, I know why, because nobody scrolls, right? Nobody scrolls ever. I know this. The fold, it's all about the fold. If it's not visible above the fold, it's not visible at all, right? Because I heard from Jacob Nielsen that things above the fold get engagement, and then things below the fold do not get engagement. Right? Nobody scrolls. Well, if you actually go and look at what people do on the internet, and here we'll look at 25 million session, it turns out that people usually scroll right away, especially on the web. Do you know why they scroll right away? Because you put a bunch of useless crap on the top of the screen nobody cares about. And the first thing they want to do is get rid of it. So the most viewed area is actually right above that little fold line. And then about 50% of readers will see 1,500 pixels down as the page contents. And on home pages and section fonts, about 50% of people make it to pixel 1,000. So it's a little bit different than what you've been led to believe in the fold. And those readers who do scroll down actually spend much more time down on the page than they do at the top. The pixels at the top of the page are in view for the shortest amount of time, about 4 seconds, and the amount of time spent viewing steadily rises as we move down the page to a peak of about 1,200 pixels or so. And this whole keep things above the fold, if that were true, this control of just a button above the fold versus this Challenger landing page of a whole bunch of things, which is actually 20x longer than the control, would clearly convert better, right? It turns out, no, the Challenger actually converts a lot better than the control. And the key thing from this study, which I really like to call out over and over again, is the issue isn't whether the call to action is visible. The issue is whether the call to action is visible when somebody wants to take the action. Right? Just putting a giant button that says subscribe doesn't necessarily help you. And I also really like this quote because it resonates really strongly with me for mobile design, where screens are smaller. We don't have giant desktop screens to fill with information. We need to make these hard decisions. What is important? What is the right time and right place for content and actions? Coming back to scrolling, though, it's not that people don't scroll, right? It's just that they need to understand that they can scroll or what they're scrolling for. So when do they not scroll? They don't scroll when content or layout feels like it ends. Like there's no indication that there's anything further. That's when people don't scroll, which reminds me of this, right? Content seems to end due to layout and design issues. That's it in a nutshell. Anyway, coming back to why this bottom bar, the ergonomics is another aspect of what we were thinking about when doing that design. Right? It wasn't just this let's simplify for newcomers, let's focus on our core features for our existing users, let's try to grow engagement by highlighting the things that create value for people. It was also like, how do we account for how people actually use this on screens? So this is all positive stuff, right, Luke? What about the negative stuff? Isn't there some bad things that happen? This all sounds like roses. And this is what always happens with case studies. People be like, hey, we did this. It was awesome. End of story. Okay? Nothing bad ever happened? Doesn't work like that. So when we launched this new tab navigation bar, we launched it without hiding it when you were scrolling it. That was due to time. We weren't able to get it out. We wanted to, but it didn't happen. And our number one complaint, hands down, was people wanted to have that go away when they were scrolling so they had more room to read the content and see all the stuff that was inside of their stream. So that was a pretty simple solution. We just, when you scroll, what we do is not only hide the bottom navigation, but we also hide the header navigation. Now this has some challenges because sometimes, when people want that nav, it's not available. But we ultimately made the compromise and said it's important enough for people to be able to see all this content full screen and not have all of our nav getting in their way. It's a secondary supporting function. It should be there when you need it, but when we have indication that you're doing something else, we'll just get it out of the way for you. So that was a big issue. People complained a lot, but we were able to get around it pretty quickly. The second biggest issue we got stemmed from this page, which there was this thing called Android Developer Guidelines, which explicitly says don't use bottom tab bars. Other platforms use the bottom tab bar, but Android does not. So don't do this. And man, did we hear about that. This is so anti-material design. Why are you so iOS-y? Don't use iOS style on Android. Right, it was just earful upon earful around this issue. And it was one of the things that made it challenging, right? We knew from the quantitative data, we knew from the qualitative data, we felt like we were doing the right thing for our users and for the application and for the service, right? But we had these other issues hanging around our heads around how do we manage this? Well, ultimately, the way we managed this was we launched the bottom navigation menu. We told people how well it worked, and other apps inside of Google started to use it. And then the material design guidelines change to support bottom navigation menus. So you can enact change, right? And I think when you have good supporting arguments around why you're doing something, this was my point at the very beginning, understanding why goes a huge way versus like, we just did this because it like looks good. Much harder to make those arguments. So that was complaint number 2, and I think over time we were able to get over complaint number 2 because we were able to shift sort of high-level guidelines around the entire platform. And complaint number 3 was people just didn't like it. This stupid gray bar at the bottom is a horrible thing. This is one of my favorite translations of a comment I got from another human. I brain-free spraying manure G+ bottom bar for a long time. Now even the Google gallery has also been falling. At Luke W., your mom blew up. I contacted my mom. She had, in fact, not blown up yet, but I'm not sure about the brain-free spraying manure. Now, you know, it's actually quite concerning to hear how much passion people have around mobile navigation. I'm pretty sure I can't read this one to you out loud, but damn, really? It's just a couple buttons in an app, dude. Like, you gotta go there? Now, is it change aversion? Is it, you know, people who really believed we were breaking guidelines that we had put out there? No, I view that as things evolve, we learn, it's okay. As we learn new things, it's much better for us to communicate those things to you rather than pretending they didn't happen, right? Or whether people just genuinely have a dislike for certain design treatments. Whatever the root cause is, ouch is all I'm going to say about that one. When things like this happen, though, I really like to come back to this quote, which I've sadly used for a long time. And then the quote basically says, I don't know what the key to success is, but the key to failure is trying to please everybody. Right? When you try to make something where everybody's happy, you're never going to go anywhere. Because especially when you have services that have hundreds of millions of users, every opinion you can imagine exists in bulk. And if you just jump from one opinion to the other, you're never going to go anywhere. And I used this quote for a long time, but sadly I have to now stop using it because of its source. The nice thing about it is everybody sort of knew who he was, so the source had some authority. Now it's sort of like everybody knows who he is, so the source is kind of bad. So at the risk of sounding like a comic book nerd and identifying myself as such, I found this sentiment from a fellow named Eric Larson equally compelling. Somebody asked him, you know, hey, you've been making comic books for 30-something years, something ridiculous like this. You know, what's the number one thing that you've learned from this career? And what he said was, look, you can't please everybody and don't try. Trying to please everybody is the road to madness. And this is from Eric Larson. I think this is an equally compelling sentiment. And it just sort of reflects on the reality of building products and services, right? We have to make decisions. Those decisions are not going to appease everybody. And it's another really important reason about why we want to understand the why behind what we're doing. Why did I walk you through all those processes we went through with that bottom bar navigation, right? Because when we came time to make a decision, we felt sentiment like this out there. We had the conviction and the knowledge to know what we were doing was the right thing. And we could back it up. We could argue it with internal design review teams. We could feel compelled to talk to users and say, you know, hey, we genuinely believe this is the right thing. Because you're going to get that kind of pushback. And since this is a tech talk, maybe it's better to quote people in the tech industry instead of in the comic book industry. So this is from the former head of Windows, Mr. Steven Sinofsky. And as he eloquently puts it, you need to have a point of view. Products without a point of view have no point. And so data is there, right? Data will help inform us. Data will help us make decisions. But anytime somebody uses the phrase data-driven on my team, I stop them immediately and say, no, 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 we are data informed. Data does not make decisions for us, we make decisions. We try and understand as much as we can about the data to make the best decisions possible. But ultimately, we need a compass. We need a point of view. We need to do things that we believe in, and we need to have supporting information to help us make those decisions, but we're not beholden to what data tells us to do. And that point of view equally applies to changes that may seem trivial, right? Like it may seem sort of trivial to put a navigation bar inside of an application. But as you saw, this trivial change can have a huge impact, and it actually took a lot of thinking, process, and work. And you may say, well, all of this for such an obvious change, it's sort of obvious to put that on there. I could have told you to do that, right? It's obvious. Is it worth all this work for something so obvious? Well, you tell me. To come back to the earlier stuff, you know what I mean? So to summarize what we discussed about mobile design, we can't just simply copy patterns, things like the hamburger menu, without understanding why they do or they don't work. To get to this kind of understanding, we need to have an iterative process, right? And that iteration really boils down to a process of learning. I heard a good quote recently which says, the learning is so much more important than the delivery, than the project, because the learning represents your future. It's what you're going to do next and what you're going to do after that, right? So the learnings from a project are so much more important than the project itself because they represent what's next. And so that iteration can be really strongly informed by insights, whether they're quantitative or qualitative. But no matter how data informed you are and how right you feel your results are and how good you feel about the confidence you have in some of these choices, someone's always going to disagree, and that's okay. Right? You're not going to please everyone. And in fact, the most impactful changes are probably the ones that are least popular. Does anybody remember when Facebook introduced the newsfeed? How did that go over? So if you're doing something that people hate, it's probably a sign that you're doing something interesting. Now, ideally, people love it as well. Not the same people, right? When you do something that people either love or hate, that's when you know you're doing something that matters, right? That actually has an impact. If people neither love nor hate it, don't even care about it, are totally indifferent, probably means it's not necessarily anything interesting. So that's the mobile design side of the coin. To come back to the obvious situation on mobile, right? We talked about the mature market, larger phones, web and native, and hopefully I showed you how some understanding of what's going on in the market today also helps us inform how we build and design products for that market, right? So these two things are really related, and they're part of getting informed, right? I view some of those statistics and trends as the same kind of insights that we get from our quantitative data or qualitative data talking to the humans who use our products. And all this stuff together really forms a picture. So that's what I got for my portion. When we come back, I'm going to ask you all questions that you have, and we'll pull up slides to try and answer them. But until then, enjoy the break, and thanks.